Friends, welcome. We are so happy that you're here. And of course, we didn't realize at the time that it was like the Vikings football opener. It's like the first week, everyone's kids are in school, if you've got kids in school. And so that you have trekked all the way here for our live recording is just incredible. And we have Kelly Grosklags here with us, and Doug is going to dive in. Did I say your name wrong?
Most people do. Grosklags.
There's no, what about the K?
It's you just don't
It's
say
a
it.
silent
It's a
K.
silent K.
Like night.
In Jackson, the K is silent. Jackson. Talia, Jackson.
Yeah,
Jackson.
but it's really okay if you say it wrong. Grosklags.
Grosklags.
I mean, we could just do an hour and a half of what my name is.
This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and guests. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. This podcast also does not establish a standard of care, doctor-patient, or client relationship. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. And because each person is so unique, all listeners are encouraged to connect with counseling and medical professionals for assistance with their personal journey. All people, places, and scenarios mentioned in the podcast have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved.
Welcome to We're Not Fine. I'm Dr. Talia Jackson.
And I'm Doug Jensen. We thank you for listening every week to our deep and thought-provoking conversations about relationships.
This is like one of my favorite topics, even though it's a little bit difficult and sad and full of grief, but I don't even know where to start with this person sitting next to me. On a very personal note, you are one of my best friends forever. You have been one of my biggest supports in my practice, Kelly, and you are, and everybody in this world that knows about my inner circle and chosen family, you are part of that. So I am so grateful for you in my life, and really grateful to have you here as a professional who has done so much really critical work on death and dying and the grief process. And so I cannot wait to have this conversation, my dear. This topic also, because Kelly has worked with a lot of chronic and terminal illness. I've worked with mostly HIV and AIDS in my practice and career. So we've been sharing stories as well across the time period. And we actually went to grad school together, went into a grief class together. It's very funny to look back 30 years about that. So it's been quite a journey. I'm going to give this person all the credit they deserve, however, and kind of just read this beautiful bio. Kelly, LICSW, BCD, all kinds of certifications. I don't want to say that next
letters?
one. Is a highly renowned expert and compassionate clinical psychotherapist in the areas of oncology, palliative care, and hospice. With over 28 years of experience, she has dedicated her life to supporting patients, families, and healthcare providers on their healing journeys, offering solace and guidance through grief and end-of-life care. The founder of Conversations with Kelly, of which I have been a guest, an online and live interaction speaking engagement platform. Kelly's also an executive producer, author. She will sign your book if you'd like to buy one today. An international speaker who embodies the art of compassionate communication through transformative guidance, supporting and empowering medical professionals and patients during times of serious illness, grief, and loss. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, everybody. Truly. And I did not write that bio. I don't like that, but they insisted that something be written.
We did.
So I'm so honored. When Doug asked me, it was like, well, of course. And then I had 10 people say the Vikings are on. And I'm like, well, they're going to lose anyways. So why don't you just come? But I think they won. Didn't they win? Yeah. So they won, which is great. But I'm honored to be here. I think people, they don't realize what goes into something like this, because when you show up and everything looks put together, there's so much behind the scenes. One of the things Doug had sent me an agenda, and I said, I'll look at it, but I love to just kind of like channel and say what comes to me. So I have not prepared and rehearsed like I probably should, like a good guest would.
We just write out our thoughts of what we'd like to cover, because we have so many pretty incredible, so many ideas of what we want to talk about with you. But we just go with it.
And as these two know, I created the itinerary in my hot tub one morning.
So, we've been calling it the hot tub itinerary.
It's where I think the best.
So the topic of today, as a grief therapist of 30 years, is talking to us about how the dying teach us how to live, just insights from the bedside, from holding hands with the dying and the bereaved and the families. And it just really, we want to know what those insights are. And maybe we can get a head start on fine tuning and being more intentional about the way that we're living our lives so that we don't find out on our deathbed for the first time.
Right.
But so when we talk about learning from the dying, like, what does that mean to you?
So one of the oxymorons for me, or one of the oxymorons when I talk to people, is that I learn how to live from people who are dying. And what do I mean by that? And not everybody that I work with is in a bed who's actively, what we would call actively dying. But I have walked with thousands of people in my career to the end. And I've been in the presence of hundreds when they've taken their last breath.
Wow.
For me, it's about what matters most. And it's the dying, their worlds can get very small and yet not less profound. And so it's about what matters most to you. And one of the things in my bio is I'm an executive director of a documentary titled Dying is Not Giving Up. And it features Judy Erdahl, who's a woman dying of metastatic breast cancer. And I asked her in there, Judy, what matters most now? And she said, my people, my dog, my people. And if you have a cat, add that in there too. But it's really comes down to your people and what matters most. And I would see the world through the dying, through their eyes, and learn to appreciate things more. There's a sunny day today. And it's fall. If you're terminally ill, you don't know if you're going to have another fall, or if you're going to see another snowstorm, or if you're going to experience another beginning of the school year. So you embrace these things. And many have said, why didn't I fill in the blank? Why didn't I appreciate this before this? Why did it take this? And so I really do. I pause a lot in my life and I think about certain patients I've worked with. And for me, it's really about what comes down to what matters most in life. And we all have to answer that for ourselves, right? That's an individual thing. We have to answer what matters most to us. And there's no judgment on what your answer would be. But I think coming down to it being very personal and what matters most. And I would encourage everybody listening to this to kind of pause and think, what does matter most to me now? And that's where your energy should go.
It's so interesting to me, Kelly, and I've always thought this, and one of the issues that we kind of talk about is why these insights happen at that time, right? And you mentioned that the world can become very small. For anybody who's done therapy with me or otherwise, you find yourself wanting to live your best life. Like you want to find yourself living in the moment. You want to be thoughtful about your decisions. You want to live balance. You want to have relaxation in your life so that you're not always running and stressed. And it's so interesting because that experience kind of forces people to stop and really think about those things. So not only are people oftentimes bedridden, right? And so you're not going to be going to work and battling traffic and all of those things. But, it's so interesting to me that at that time is when these really, really vivid, I wish I had done this, or this is what needs to happen. Or we oftentimes hear about people who make resolution with their kids or other loved ones or whatnot, or say, I'm sorry, and have these clarities. What do you think about that? Like, go ahead.
Well, so there is a Hawaiian prayer that I would encourage everybody to look up titled Ho'oponopono. And it's
beautiful.
Basically, if you just Google Hopo, it'll come up, but it's a Hawaiian prayer by a psychiatrist that was able to heal several people on an inpatient psych unit. And there's 4 mantras. And I've seen it often in my work with people. And it's, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you.
Wow.
And so a lot of my work has been centered around that. Now, we both have seen at the end where there's estrangement. And one of the things I say, because I work with, when people are terminally ill, there's not a cure. Okay, that doesn't mean that they're gonna die today, but they will not necessarily have a cured illness. But everybody can heal. And so one of the things that we work on a lot and where these insights come in are, I'm sorry, please forgive me, thank you, and I love you. And it can be really applied to a lot of situations in this lifetime. And to hear people at the end who have been estranged, and to see, let's say it's a daughter walks into a room and they've been estranged from their mother, and they both get to say, I'm sorry, and thank you for this, and I love you. Not a lot more has to be said, in all honesty.
It's so powerful. I mean, I just think about like and of course, like we do relationships, we do marriages, and I just think about like those 4 phrases. They're the cure all, and they're also what we withhold from our most intimate partners the most.
Yeah.
And it's like if you have this wake up call that as if it's your last time, which
That's right.
Why is that so hard for us to wake up?
Well, it was so interesting you said that, because what I was thinking is that we oftentimes play that game. Like if you had a week to live, what would you do? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it does magnify the focus on what's important. Right. So it's interesting that we can't do that every day.
Right. It's almost like a slap in the face, wake up call, epiphany, and then you just go about your day.
Yeah.
And I just also think about all the times that we're like, oh, we have to do this and we have to, then now we have to. And it just like, there are people probably on their deathbed thinking like, you get to.
So so I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things I catch myself doing is when I say, oh, I've got to go to the grocery store.
Right.
And then I think there's space for both. And I think there's space to be human.
Yes.
I don't want to go to the freaking grocery store. And yet
real.
I have had many people say to me, I would love to have the energy to go to the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
And the things they took for granted. Now, one of the most incredible things that I have actually witnessed is people having love for themselves. Because many people that I work with, especially at the bedside, and sometimes, so I was on an inpatient hospice unit. That's where I worked. So I have had people die at home, and I've been at that bedside, but mostly I would do my rounds in the morning. And sometimes, I mean, there were days I had 3 people die. There were days nobody died, but everybody, there was terminally ill and dying. Right. And so one of the most beautiful things would be, and especially with the patients that I worked with that had HIV and AIDS, who maybe got a lot of messages from the world that you're not lovable. Mm-hmm. And I think there are many of us in this lifetime, you don't have to be HIV positive or to have a disease, that maybe thought, I never heard I love you. I never heard you're good. I never heard you're talented. I never heard. We see that all the time as therapists, right?
Yeah. Or you're enough.
Or you're enough. And to hear patients say, I really believe I was a good person, is one of the most beautiful things. And that can be moments before they die. That can be a week before they die. And then just to sit with them and say, what does that feel like to say that? And it's a foreign feeling. And I'll say, why do you say that? Well, because people are coming in here and treating me with respect. Therefore, I must be a good person.
Yeah.
But I was told I wasn't by so many people in this world. I start to believe it. So it's another thing I think the dying have encouraged me to do is pause and go, what messages have I started believing about myself, about others? Mm-hmm. And how do I, again, pause and rethink about, who am I? Who do I want to be? I do a ton of legacy work with people, ton of legacy work.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it can be as sitting down. I work with a lot of young people. So writing letters for their kids when they graduate from high school or start kindergarten or whatever that may be, to doing videos with people. But it doesn't have to be that grandiose. It can be, your legacy is, I was kind to somebody who others weren't kind to.
Yeah.
Or when people think of me, they're going to think of me as somebody that allowed for their humanness and not judged it and still showed them love, or whatever that may be. So we create our legacies long before we die. But it's when people are terminal that they really become to focus on it. Our legacies can also change. Some people who struggle with addiction have said to me, great, I'm going to be known as the alcoholic, mother who never went to anything. And now they're changing things and they're seen as the mother who was doing the work and was showing up. And that's a different legacy. So it's not too late to change the legacy.
Like even as you're dying, you can become the person that you want to be. And I wrote a question that I'm sort of laughing about because all it does is show how desperate I am to know the right answer. But it's literally like, okay, so Kelly, if we could take all of the life lessons and turn it into a manifesto of, I want to get off of this hamster wheel that's going 1,000 miles an hour. So what do I wake up and say to myself every day? Is it like, don't waste a moment doing blank, right?
Right.
But it's like, and instead spend your precious time doing blank. And of course, you just said it's not a one size fits all, but we do have to wake up and decide what that is for ourselves. And
yeah, and
tattoo.
As Buddha, and I'll quote Buddha, even though we're at Buddha Row, Buddha says our biggest mistake is we think we have more time.
Yeah.
And, it's not that, and some people will think that's a real downer, but again, we see every day in the news how life changes. And every one of my patients have said to me, I knew this could happen, but I never thought it would.
Right.
And whatever that may be.
Well, and it's interesting. And I get very stuck in so many thoughts as we're having this conversation, which I know happens every time, right? I get very distracted. I want to back up a little bit, Kelly, and I think it's important to note something that you said about how the circumstances that you're dying within can impact what those insights are, what the availability of your emotional well-being and health is to even have those insights. And I will tell you, and it brings back, as anybody who knows me knows, my work in the early 90s with people dying of HIV was really traumatic. And you and I have talked about this many times, but when people are ostracized by religion or they have been closeted about their HIV status because of the communities that they grow up in, when they know that their partner is going to get kicked out of the house because we did not have, as gay people, legal rights at that point. But that isolation, the stigma surrounding an illness, we used to call it the C word. Cancer is, the C word historically, and we're talking more about it now.
Right.
And so the ability to talk, like when commercials started coming on about HIV prevention drugs, I remember I was walking up my stairs and I stopped and I stared at the TV. I'm like, what?
Right.
We have made such progress and now they're kind of everywhere, right? But I will tell you that this beautiful conversation we're having about insights at the end of life only happen if you have the availability emotionally to do that.
That's right.
And it's really tough when you are alone. And I will tell you, so many people died without their parents knowing where they were, or knowing what their status was, and they did not want anyone to know because of stigma. So it's a very sad thing, and that complicates that insight and that centeredness.
It does. And then, of course, cultural differences and diversity will impact it, because certain ethnic groups do not want to talk about there's some superstition also that if you talk about it, it will make it happen. And so I've worked with all different belief systems and races and sexual orientation, whatever it may be. But I will tell you that my experience at the end of life is the one thing that is very universal is that we all want to feel love. And that we all want to feel like we matter. And that doesn't really, and I can work with a lot of people, and I'll tell you, there's a whole topic that a lot of people want to talk about, and that is these deathbed visions that people have. And these conversations I've walked in many times with atheists, and it's like they're having conversations with people in the room, not people in the spirits or whatever they may be. I've walked in and I've interrupted many conversations, And I know when somebody is getting closer to death because there's a look, and they will look through me. They're looking at something else, but they're looking at me, but through me. And in the beginning, when I was a baby clinician, I used to think these were hallucinations.
Well, we were taught, by the way, to think that.
And we were taught by that. Wow. And that was exactly. Yeah. And it was like, but how can Mrs. Johnson be hallucinating when she's not on anything? She's not on any narcotics. Okay, so that's interesting. And there was these themes about it. So it was like, then it became this thing about, it really doesn't matter what your political stance is or what your religious stance is or whatever. I mean, at the end, it's about wanting love and connection. And there's just been so many beautiful things that have happened that I've been able to witness that would make, when people say, what if I told you there was nothing after this? And I would say, I don't believe you.
Because of what you've seen.
Because of what I've seen.
Years.
Now, I don't care what you call it.
Yeah.
Call it universe, call it source, call it tree, call it God, call it goddess, call it Allah, call it Jehovah. It doesn't matter to me. I've gotten less and less attached to that because of all that I've seen. I'm like, it comes down to this universal love. And that's one of the greatest things I've been taught is because I've have people in my life that are very judgmental religiously. And I don't believe the right way. And I don't believe in the right things. And I can kind of, at this point now say, I don't need your approval because I know at the end, it's this universal experience of love. And whatever you want to call it, if that's important to call it something, but don't judge another person for not believing that way. Right. Because I'm telling you, when you're in the bed at the end, it's going to look very similar.
I want to comment on your and I remember a lot of times my clients would be in foster care or in a clinical setting, a hospital. I worked at HCMC primarily in my work with the dying. And I remember very clearly this guy kept looking up at the corner of the room and I said, what are you looking at? He goes, there's a light there. Right. Wow. And so it was every time. And the light was getting bigger from week to week to week to week. And I remember thinking, okay, I don't know what that is, but it is something. Yeah. And, I went to the doctor and I talked about it and they talked about possibly some eye issues and vision issues, of course, that might explain it. And I'm like, I don't think so. I don't think that's it. And boy, as I have grown and I have had clients come to me with messages from the beyond for me or have ghosts with them. And, people will recognize this. It's like, there's something, I don't know what it is. But, not everyone has that experience, right? And so I think this idea of there's nothing else out there can be very scary or it can be very calming.
Absolutely. Right? And I talk with one of the things in therapy that I would talk a lot with my terminally ill patients about, because they would say, what if they don't have that experience? What does that mean for them? And I'm guessing most people have had some experience, but maybe can't verbalize it, or they're just now I've seen what we would consider the layperson comatose people, unresponsive people, open up their eyes, reach up their arms, and sit up.
Wow.
And these are people that haven't believed in anything. And I'm not really here to sell people that you have to believe something. It would be hard for me to say there's not something. And for the bereaved, that again can be a very tricky thing because they'll say, I don't necessarily believe in anything, but I want to believe my dad is still, spirit is still living. So then I do think part of my mission in life has been to share these experiences. So a little background is my mom, Sandy, died when I was 11 and she was 33 and she had a heart attack when we were grocery shopping. And I witnessed the CPR and she went to Fairview Southdale Hospital, died 3 months later. But I will tell you, it would have been very helpful at that time to have somebody more trained in end-of-life care, because it was really, she was either living or dead. And there really wasn't anything in between. Yeah. There wasn't a lot of, here, honey, maybe you can have these conversations with your mommy because she can still hear you. Yeah. Instead, it was shove me into the ICU and go tell her you love her. And that was so scary. Yep. But one of the things we've learned is that the dying, their last of senses is the hearing. So even if they're not responding, we know people can hear, and we have countless opportunities to prove that. Where son comes in from Australia, she hears him and she dies 2 minutes later. Yep. So I think it's just really important to, again, and I've seen so much forgiveness at the end. I'm sure you have too, Doug. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've seen so much forgiveness happen at the end, both from patient to loved one, from loved one to patient.
Yeah.
We did the same program and we had a clinical research paper that we needed to do at the end. And of course,
don't bring that up.
Although I remember you got done with yours really quick and I was really bitter. I'm like, oh
and that was before AI.
I know, right? Doggone it.
Chat GPT.
But, it was interesting
before Google.
Because I did mine on the use of ritual in the grieving process for people with HIV, remember? And I remember every single person that I interviewed would have these amazing new insights on spirituality and the afterlife. And a lot of people got spiritual, right, in that process.
Yeah.
And I remember looking at all of them like, where did that come from and why now?
Yeah.
But it just was a really interesting thing. So when you talk about, the forgiveness model, I would also say that, boy, spirituality was in everyone's forte. Like what happens after this? Everyone wanted to know, which we all do, by the way. I mean, we're all kind of curious, right? Like what happens after we die? And some of us think we know.
Right.
And it does bring some comfort, even though nobody actually knows, but we pull together these stories,
these near-death experiences.
Yes.
And our psychic we have on the show, Kaya, who I literally just said, what happens when we die? And she goes, you're not going to like the answer. I'm like, okay. And I made a comment that there are people that will not go where some of us go who are trying to be nice people on this planet.
Yeah.
She said, you all go to the same place. It's called the source. She used your word.
Oh my God. I love her so much. I know. I was like, wait, what? We're not going to like the answer. What did she say? I got really stressed.
She didn't like the answer. She said I wouldn't like the answer because everyone goes to the same one. And I'm like, there's no way some of these people go to the same place.
Right.
There's no way Nick Harper goes to the same place. Love you, Nick, wherever you are. So yeah, it's interesting though.
Yeah, it's, and again, I think I've also learned there's a lot of situations in life that we think are irreplaceable or
irreparable.
Yeah, or like non-repairable, like you can't repair it. And I've just seen some of the most beautiful, these relationships that have been able to repair. And again, so it's interesting. So when I've asked, there's a theme that comes, and I use this a lot when I work with people who have had a death by suicide in their family. Yeah. Because of the hundreds I've worked with, and I ask often a question, do you have any regrets that you want to talk to me about? And there are some of the ones, I wish I didn't work so much, or, but there were these two resounding themes that came through that were very much true of hundreds of, if not thousands of people is, Kelly, I wish I would have worried less about things. Oh, okay. What kinds of things did you worry about? I have no idea.
Right.
And isn't that telling?
It is.
I have no idea. And then secondly, I want the people in my life to always remember me.
Mm.
And I want them to find joy again and keep living.
Mm.
So on one hand, keep me alive. Keep my memory alive, honor me, but don't withhold from yourself joy because I'm not here to experience it. And so for me, those are the two resounding things. So I think about that again a lot with my mom, because my mom and I did not get to have these conversations. Mm-hmm. I mean, first of all, she couldn't speak. And secondly, I was 11. But I will often I will feel guilty that, I got to have this beautiful life. She never got to whatever because she was only 33. And then I think about my patients and what they've taught me. And they've taught me that, you can continue to honor these people and still have joy in your life. So I go back to that. And I do talk to a lot of bereaved. And so if you're here or listening to this and you had somebody die suddenly, car accident, catastrophic heart attack, whatever, suicide, homicide, I believe those people, your people, would say that some version of that as well, because I've heard it from so many that I start applying it to any situation that, okay, they want us to honor them. How do we honor them? We say their name. We always say their name. We go to the grave. We whatever ways feels comfortable for you, but then we keep living in their honor.
Yes.
And finding joy.
And we can find even more joy, like if we're cooking something that they loved, or if we sprinkle them, or even just some ritual under a tree that's then blooming. I mean, I love the idea of keeping them alive, which at the beginning, sometimes when you're grieving, it feels like a big bummer that it's like, that's it. I have to keep them alive. Yeah. I thought they were going to be like visiting me and hanging out with me and telling me secrets. But one thing that you said, Kelly, that just gave me chills. And of course, as I'm writing in like my manifesto of what I have to remember every single day, when you were saying that it's basically like the universal themes, to be loved and to have mattered.
Yeah.
And what I really love about that is it sounds like they're like passive things that like, oh, I am loved and I mattered. But they're both things that we can actually contribute greatly to every day as a lifestyle, as
That's
something
right.
that we're showing up. Like to love is to be loved, to contribute something interesting to like what is enough? What does mattering even mean? Just mattering to someone or something or being there, showing up.
Think of how it would feel if you said, I am not loved and I don't matter.
Right.
Like, think of what that feels like.
Well, and did you ever see that movie? Remember What the Bleep Do We Know?
Yeah.
Where it's like
I didn't see it though, but
oh my gosh, it was like 1,000 years ago, but it was fascinating. And it was this idea, there was like a monk that did these blessings over these molecules of water. And that there were like either these blessings of like, you're beautiful, you are loved, you are enough. And then there was like, you're disgusting, you're ugly, I wish you were dead. And then they watched over, I don't even know how, like a time lapse of the development of each molecule of water. And I mean, I believe everything and nothing at the same time, but I will tell you, I believe that.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like the loved water molecules were like these beautiful snowflake shapes.
Oh, yeah.
You know, kaleidoscope. And then the hated water molecules were like yellow and sickly. I'm sure you can look up that study somewhere. But if that's your narrative, if that's what you're telling yourself, if that's what other people tell you every day,
right.
It makes you sick.
Yeah, it can make you sick. You know, talk about little things maybe on the provider's end too. I'm reminded of a client who had the death rattle, the breathing pattern that you know that they are near death. And I remember leaning into him and he was, we're not supposed to have favorites in the work that we do, but I did. And I helped him I took him down the stairs of the nursing home, took off his IVs and took him to the lake one more time. I would have lost my license in a second had anybody known that. And I said, you cannot tell people. So I was carrying this very emaciated person with AIDS at the end of his life, just taking him to Lake Calhoun one more time.
But I bet it would have been worth it.
It was worth it. I have no regrets. The person who acted as his mother at the memorial said, I know what you did. And I'm like, oh, I'm going to lose my license. And she said it was the nicest thing ever.
Absolutely.
But I'll tell you, I also leaned into him when he was probably about 5 minutes from death. And I said, come back and tell me what's on the
Oh my God, I love that.
And I remember he smiled at me and I'm like, he's going to tell me. He's going to come back and tell me he did.
Wait, but is he maybe the ghost that's in your office at the top of the hallway? Is he trying to talk to you?
For anybody that comes to my office,
there's a ghost
in my building. Everyone has seen it but me. I can't.
I haven't seen it. But there is a creepy room in your like boiler room in the basement. Yeah. Okay, I have a concern that you've already skipped to the next page, but you had a question that I really want you to ask. It's like my favorite one.
About the not peaceful?
Yeah.
I feel like we kind of covered that, but you know, it's like when people don't have a good experience and they end up at the end of their life angry or bitter or resentful or rageful and just pissed off at their circumstance. And boy, I will tell you, that was very common in the HIV world. You know, I remember.
Why wouldn't it be?
You know, I had an African-American guy who was on the down low, is what, I guess what we might say. And so he was having, secret sex and not telling people that he was attracted to men. And he was just angry and no one could know. And he's like, you can't tell anybody I'm here. What a sad circumstance, but he was so angry at his circumstance and he was not going to live. Right. Yeah. And so it's an interesting thing. What do we learn from that? And how do we manage that? I mean, I remember very clearly, it was not hard for me to be with that person.
Right.
As anyby who knows my clinical work, I'm not afraid of anything. So let's just talk. Right. Let's talk about what's real. Right.
Right.
But yeah, it's an interesting thing. Like, what can we learn from those experiences?
Well, people? I mean, I don't really ascribe to the stages of grief, so to speak. Kubler-Ross, who's a wonderful cornerstone of getting us going, but that was really for the dying, not for the bereaved.
Listen to us 30 years later thinking we know what's going on.
I know, right?
You're like, that's bullshit.
Yeah, right. Even though that was our textbook. And I do think Kubler-Ross had some wonderful things. And so I see people get angry. I mean, of course, I see people get angry that they're not going to live longer or that they were misdiagnosed or that, and especially for people that have a shame attached. I worked in the oncology space. So I had a lot of patients with lung cancer, liver cancer, different rectal cancer, different things that are harder to talk about. Because the first question is, did you smoke? Do you drink a lot?
Yep.
Do you whatever? And it's like, first of all, my response is always, what does it matter? And so in my intakes, I never ask people that. I never ask them, did you smoke? It doesn't matter to me.
It's like a blaming.
It's a very
like,
shaming,
why are you here?
accusatory,
It is.
at the end of the day, it's still really going to be a hard thing. And so the angry patients that I've worked with several of them. And when you meet the family system, you kind of understand why. Everybody's angry. For me, anger is something I teach a lot of medical providers. That's what I do now. So I try to teach medical providers how to have conversations with people. And one of the things they will often talk to me about is one of the hardest things for them is angry people. They don't like them. They take it personally. I don't like them because every time I go in, they're yelling at me, they're whatever. And I just said, have you ever thought about what's under anger? And they'll say, yeah, pain in the ass. And I said, no.
Look deeper.
Yeah, right.
A little
right.
deeper.
And I'll say my experience under anger has been fear and grief. And so when I have really, really angry patients, and the beautiful thing about the end of life work is we just get to it because there's not a lot of time.
Right.
So I'm just going to ask you some stuff. You're probably going to answer things that you maybe wouldn't have answered 10 years ago, but we're on a time limit here and we've got work to do. So I will say to them, what scares you the most about what you're going through right now? And I actually say that to people, whether they're dying or not, if they're just chronically angry. And then, because one of the things that when I supervise interns, they'll say, there's always this joke kind of like, so I shouldn't be the therapist that looks at someone and goes, you seem angry. No, we don't do that. And that will piss them off more. Exactly. So I want to ask them, like, what are you the most scared of? And what that tends to do is break people open to tears.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where we want to get to is the tear part. And not that crying is the only way we experience
As
grief.
therapists, we love when people cry.
Yeah, we do love when
We
people
have
cry.
7,000 boxes.
We
of
do.
Kleenex
We
at
all have
times.
stock in Kimberly-Clark, but it's, I think it's one of the most gracious things I can say to people. It's not, don't be angry. I want you to be angry. But I want to get to what's under that anger because probably in your lifetime and in your family system or whatever, anger is such an interesting thing, right? Either some families were always angry or some families were never angry. It's an interesting thing. And so I want to get to what's under your anger and what scares you the most about this. And they may want to hang out in anger. Well, why the hell are you asking me that? And I'll just ask it to you until we get to it.
And that's when you say you seem angry at me.
Yeah.
Yep.
Are you angry? You seem really angry.
You
Yeah.
seem angrier and angrier.
Exactly.
Well, and it's so beautiful because like that anger, I could see why the anger would make everyone uncomfortable, right? Because it's like, oh my gosh, we don't know how much longer you have. Like, get over it to the part where you're zen and peaceful and inspiring everybody.
But people die how they live.
Oh, that's really
people die how they live. And that's been my experience. So if people were more comfortable with anger, they're going to be more comfortable at the end. If people love to party, they're going to want a lot of people around. If people are more introverted, they're going to want it quieter.
Wow.
Not that people can't do forgiveness and all of that, but in terms of who are you in your life is going to be likely what is going to resemble your death. So it's interesting. And so we can't really expect people to have this 180. Yeah. And I don't really want them unless they want to change. But if you're comfortable hanging out in anger, I'll hang out there with you. But I am going to ask you this question, Missy, what is under your anger?
Well, so Kelly, let me ask you a question. So if I'm an avoider, does that mean I'm going to be able to avoid death entirely?
Yeah, 100%. You're going to live forever. You're going to live forever.
To the audience,
Great.
that's a real question.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me write that down in my manifesto.
Right. So your
Let's say
attachment.
we have somebody who's avoidant.
Let's say
there's somebody in this room.
no, but you may want to avoid the conversations about dying. And then I'll
Right.
say to you, we don't have to talk about that, but it's still happening.
I have wanted to, but Doug won't let me.
I will let you talk about death and dying.
He won't let me not talk about it.
That's exactly right.
Oh,
That is
okay,
exactly
okay.
right. Yeah, you know what's interesting when we talk about anger? Of course, I love when people talk about their shit, like whatever it is. And I think real emotions, I think we really try to avoid them in general, Talia.
Yeah.
Some
and
of us.
Yeah. You don't actually. You do
I
pretty
know.
well. You've gotten better.
I've grown a lot.
You have.
Now I love talking about uncomfortable things.
You know what's interesting about this too? Do you remember this whole silly, and maybe it's not silly, I don't want to call it silly, but that epitaph homework.
Oh, yeah.
Like, what do you want your epitaph to read?
Oh,
Like, what do you
that's
want on your
great
tombstone?
homework.
It's okay homework.
Oh.
Because
Wow.
it's,
Well, all right then.
I'm sorry, yes, we
I've got some homework for you to do.
But you know, it's interesting because it does kind of bring up like, how do we want to live our lives?
How do you
right?
want to live your life?
And when you talk about we die as we live,
Yeah.
of course, if we
Yeah.
are thoughtful about who we want to be on this planet, which as much as I try, I'm not perfect at it. I get angry. I say things I don't mean.
Are
I
you?
get, yeah,
Yeah.
I do.
So every day is a different day. Every day is a different opportunity. And I think, you know, there have been many times I've taken things for granted. All the time.
All the time.
Even
Yeah.
when in front of me, I'm looking at this beautiful 30-year-old woman who just had a baby who's diagnosed with metastatic brain tumor and is going to die. And I'm still bitching about having to stop in the snow and get
Right.
gas.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but you know, the thing is to allow the space for all of it. I do want to catch myself though when I do that now. And that's what this has taught me is that I still get to go and all that kind of stuff. I'm also not a big fan of comparing stories in terms
Right.
of your
Mine is worse than others.
Mine is
Yeah.
worse or yours is worse. Mine
I
is
don't have a right to feel anything because this other person.
right. And we all know that there's these losses in life that would just bring us to our knees. Okay.
100%.
If you're a parent, you can imagine and these kinds of things. But what I will say is if it's happening to you, it is the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter if it's a 99-year-old parent that's dying.
Yep.
It still is too soon for
Yeah.
some people. And it doesn't matter. And I just think we spend a lot of time in this culture, and no matter what it is, comparing ourselves to other people. Comparison is the thief of joy. And we never end up really, I mean, unless there's narcissism and those things, then you end up on top. But but that's for another episode. But
It
I will say that if it's happening to you, it's the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so I really kind of lean in with people and hold that space for them that it doesn't matter that my last client in my on paper would be like horrifying. In this moment, it's happening to you and this is the hardest. And we have to let ourselves go there. We have to let ourselves have grace and have empathy. And sometimes we're the only ones that give it to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, and I've worked with some people that have really done some horrible things in life
Yeah.
on
For sure.
paper. They've
Yeah.
done some horrible
But
things in
that's
life.
also important to talk about.
Absolutely.
Always.
And like,
Yep.
it's not every saintly, like if you're on your deathbed, you've never done anything wrong and everyone's gathered around you. Like there's some real shit to reconcile.
Absolutely. And I've been, and you've been, the only one at a bedside because they have burned every single bridge.
Absolutely.
Every single bridge. And I will say, not mine to judge. I'm here. This is what's happening now. If you would do it differently, or would you do it differently? What would that look like?
Wow.
And just allow people that opportunity to dream a different life.
And grieve.
Well, and not to get too far into that clinically, but whenever somebody has that, like when people have asked me, like, what's the most complex thing you've encountered? Like I've had two murderers, right? One that got caught,
Yes.
the other one did not. So he
Yes.
was living with the awareness that he killed somebody and nobody found out, right? And as
Mm.
clinicians, we can't disclose past grievances. We can only disclose future
Right.
murders, or I know it's
Right.
it's an interesting thing.
I've tried
So
to
we-
get more information about this, but he won't give me any.
So, you know, the thing though about it is there's always a reason why people end up where they are. There's always an explanation. And that's the beauty of doing therapy and going deeper
Mhm, mhm.
is that you get to help people understand the sequence of events or the lifetime childhood experiences that led them to do what they are. Kelly, I'm going to just own that you actually have confronted me on minimizing when I had melanoma. Like I didn't even tell you. So I had a tumor removed and my doctor had called and said, you have deadly melanoma.
And you just said it like I bought a new jacket. Right. I was like, hold on, go back.
Yeah, that was my friend Kelly confronting me on, you're minimizing the fact that you have a left.
And so some of us do that to make ourselves feel better, right? Because
Like,
it's scary. Because it's scary.
Yeah.
But I also think, wow, that's a big thing. You know?
It could have been a big thing. And I might even minimize it today because it was okay. Like I had stage 1. I didn't know it was stage 1. I was told it was deadly.
Yeah.
And so, but the thing is, people die of that, right? Like, and you go on the line when you get a diagnosis of some kind. I went on the internet and boy, I was like aware of how many people, including President.
Never go on
It was
the
awful.
internet
Like all these people who died, right?
I know.
Kelly, I'm so glad you're alive, by the way.
Thank you.
Me too.
I wanted to ask you a question of like when you're sitting with somebody who clearly has burned all the bridges, is in a pit of despair or rage or not fair or whatever it is, do you feel like it's your role to help them die well? Or do you feel like it's just your role to witness and be by them as they like die as they've lived?
Yeah.
I mean, what is your role?
So yes, my role is to help people die well. I mean, I'm not the judge. I'm not, and it's hard to know some of these things about people. Yeah. You know, it's hard. It's hard to know that somebody murdered a child. I mean, that's hard to know. But there's and that, again, that is something we might talk about. And I certainly have liked some patients better than others. I mean, I don't adore every patient I've worked with. Just because they're dying doesn't mean that, I adore them, so to speak.
Right.
But it is my job to show respect. And I think about, especially when people have remorse. When people don't have remorse, that's a different story.
That's even harder to say.
But I have not crossed that very much.
Okay.
I mean, because I don't work in the prison system. So I don't work I've worked with prisoners when they come to the hospital to die.
I think that's your next calling.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
But
I'm sure it's not.
But it's important work for somebody to do. That's really great.
For sure.
But it's not all Pollyanna either. I mean, I have really sat with some very hard situations, but if we can get to the place of the 4 mantras, and I have had people say to somebody that has committed adultery and, had affairs and whatever. And they're just absolutely devastated. The whole family's devastated and whatever. And I just am kind of like, okay, that's hard, but let's get in here and do the work. The I forgive you or I'm sorry doesn't mean the person's actions were right. Or please forgive me. Thank you. It doesn't mean that the actions are right. It's just that the letting go and the forgiveness work is going to be better for the person doing it. It's not, I've had people at the end. I literally have had fist fights over dying bodies where brothers
Seriously?
I could tell you thousands of stories.
Maybe just the fist fight one.
Okay.
Were you in the fist fight?
No, thank God. But I was like ducking.
I really want to know more.
No, there was a situation. So when I don't have these shoes on, I'm only 5'3". I'm only 5'3".
You're gonna reenact.
Are scrappy.
Yeah, and so there was a prisoner that's mother was dying, and for me, and he was in a it was horrible. But anyways, I called the prison and I said, my patient really needs to see her son. And I don't think she's going to die well until she sees him. And they oftentimes when they're incarcerated, they get an opportunity to say goodbye to the dying person or go to the funeral, but not both. And she really wanted to see him. And he had done some very horrible things. I actually said to her, I don't want to know what they are. I don't want to know what they are. Not mine to judge. I don't care. But she really wanted to see him. She would moan and cry out his name and cry out his name. So long story short, got them to come. They had him in shackles and he was shackled to the wheelchair. And I thought, this is such a disgrace. So I went and got him a blanket for some dignity, covered him up. And it's this big, huge security guard, just really like, tough ass, whatever. And I'm just okay. And I don't think I had a bow in my hair that day, but I might have had I was 23, might have had a little bow in my hair with a skirt or something. I'm not quite sure, but it was quite a scene, more Candy Striper-ish than therapist-ish, So
Wow.
he comes in and I said, would you be willing just to take off this cuff? He's shackled to everything. Just take off one so he could touch his mom.
And you used your best 23-year-old clinical
Exactly.
judgment.
And he said, who the hell do you think you are? And that's when then I turned Italian.
You turned Italian.
Yeah, I turned Italian.
And then was there a K in your last name?
Yeah, there was a K.
Okay.
Well, it was Tremonti was the Italian name. But I said, listen to me.
Oh, I love
And
it.
I did. And I said, if your mother was dying and you did something wrong, what decision would you make right now based on your mother?
Chills. I
know.
love it.
And I said, think about your mother.
Mm.
Okay. So he took it off and he got to touch
God,
her.
this is so good.
There's a more to the story, but everybody that I worked with was like, what is she doing down there? I'm looking at him like this because I was super short, but I just said, I'm going to, whatever. The point of the story is this. At the end, so many things can be forgiven.
Yep.
And if it is truly the last time you're ever going to see them, and many people believe that, then can we have one more I love you?
Oh,
And that's what that was about. And it was an opportunity for him to say, I'm sorry. He was a lifer. He was on death row. I didn't care. I wanted it to it was really her. She was my focus. But I thought if that gave him a moment of peace, great. But it was one more I love you.
and I'm sure it helped her so much.
Oh, she died, I think, hours later. I think it was hours later.
So the moral of the story is bring pizza and have an Italian accent if you're ever in that
Oh, yeah.
circumstance.
And then you get your needs met.
And use your finger.
Even if you're 5'3".
You use your finger.
But so there was there a fist fight? We just kind of
Oh, the other
fast-forwarded
fist
through
fight
it?
was two brothers, and they were fighting over the mother, and money can ruin families too, and inheritances.
Almost every time.
Yep.
Yeah.
And they were fighting, and he didn't do enough for her, and he didn't and I walked in, and I'm hearing all this, but I'm literally, and they're doing it over the bed, and I'm thinking, what the hell? So it was just, gentlemen, get out in the room now. And the problem is she can hear, and they're like, well, she's out of it, she can't. And so I just said, she heard every single thing you just did.
Oh,
And so then what I did, I was kind of empowering, again, probably 24 at this point, made them go in and apologize to her. And then I just said, you won't be allowed here, because it really, here's the other thing. It's a privilege to be with people when they're dying.
yeah.
It's a privilege.
Feels very sacred.
And
for
it's
sure.
very hard when I've had my loved ones die. As hard as it is, it's still a privilege. And you will lose your privilege if you can't be respectful here. And that's all I've said that thousands of times to families. You'll lose the privilege of being here.
It is beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the interesting part, right? That we're not maybe focused on as much, is that there's so much grieving that happens.
Yeah.
And especially if you have an anticipated life sentence, right? If you are given 3 months to live,
Right.
you have a lot of opportunity to do a lot of things, hopefully. And it always seems to end up in like more 3 years than 3 months. I have a client with early onset dementia and was given 2 to 17 years.
Yeah.
Oh,
And I'm like, 2 to 17, how do we even process that?
Right.
And that felt so careless to me
yeah.
Yeah.
by his medical provider,
Yeah.
right? Anyway,
Yeah.
but I work with him every week on, maximizing his life. And
Mhm.
every once in a while he'll make a joke and I say, what is your name again? I'm like, I don't think that's funny
Oh.
anymore.
Oh my God.
But his way of coping, right? So, but we were talking about grieving versus depression, right? Like
Mhm.
just from a clinical point of view, from a mental health point of view. And I want to reiterate something, and that's that all that we're talking about implies that the person who's in that bed dying has some emotional and mental and physical capacity to have these conversations
Right.
or insights. And there's so many people who have not done their work.
That's right.
So really, ideally, we all do our work and we all get in touch with things and we all think
Right.
about, like, I've actually thought as I was redoing my will for circumstances in my life about 5 years ago, I'm like, I am not letting my kids fight. This is going to be so clear
Yep.
and so very clear between my two kids what happens.
Yep.
And so I've set it up so nicely. I'm like, you two have to agree on my deathbed. What happens?
Yep.
So this is what's really going to be great. So I think it could be fun to watch.
And I hope you're alive to see it.
I am too. I'm excited about that. Like, I hope I can hear them
He'll be a
wobbling
fly
about
on
it.
the wall.
I will.
Yeah.
One of them will be very emotional. The other one will be practical. Like, he's not, let's go. Let's just pull it.
Yeah.
I never liked this bed frame anyway.
Yeah, right.
But we talk about grieving versus depression, and it might be helpful for our conversation to kind of differentiate between the two.
So there's a very thin veil between grief and depression. There is not a medication for grief. There is a place for medication in grief, but medication doesn't treat grief. And I am a little more, I like to, again, pause unless somebody is going to hurt themselves or something. But we kind of look at it. So there's a lot of similarities in grief and depression.
There are a lot.
We do tend to look, people's appetites change in grief. People's appetites change in depression. People sleep more, people sleep less. People have a hard time concentrating in both. People can ruminate in both. And I think for me, what I've looked at, in the diagnostic statistical manual, it talks about clinical depression being a 2 weeks where somebody has these pervasive symptoms. 2 weeks is nothing in grief.
Right.
If people, and because I work in a medical system, we do tend to look at kind of are people losing a lot of weight? That's a big factor. Like, are they not getting nourishment? Is there any thoughts of, so it's very common when someone has had a loss to say, I just don't know if I want to live anymore.
Yeah.
If you're trained in grief, you don't jump up and down and call the ambulance. You know that's a very common thing to say. You explore it more. But if you're not trained in grief, you consider that suicidal ideation.
Right.
Okay. We've heard countless people, I don't know if I want to live anymore. That makes a lot of sense to me, why you wouldn't want to live when your person is gone.
Yep.
That makes a lot of sense to me. That makes a lot of sense to me when you have a retractable pain from your cancer, why you don't want to do this anymore. Doesn't necessarily mean, but most suicidal people want to live. They just want the pain to be gone.
Yeah.
So, but if there's this plan that they're going to hurt themselves, if they're sabotaging things, sometimes I see that a lot in depression. They're purposely sabotaging good relationships or healthy relationships
Because of undeservingness.
And clinically they just maybe can't. But in depression, we'll see the ruminating can be much more catastrophic. Generally you can intercept in grief work with ruminating. You can kind of get in there and change the rumination, soften it a little bit. With depression, again, hopelessness can be very common in both, but the hopelessness in depression can look really dark. In grief, it tends to be, I can talk with people that, do you realize it won't always be like this? Sometimes they can say yes, sometimes they can't. Right. If it's clinical depression, normally they can't. So I don't know that I'm answering it, because the older I get and the more I'm in this field, I'm seeing so many similarities.
Like the thinner the veil.
The thinner the veil is.
Sense.
And to be honest, the treatment is the same.
Yeah.
Like, you want to manage the symptoms. You want to understand where they're coming from, what the causation is and the etiology. So I think there's a component of, and we might even encourage, like, I think for people who are going through a huge life change and they kind of find themselves, like I had a circumstance in my life at 39, I did some really huge grief work around my childhood, and I lost 40 pounds in 2 months.
Yeah.
I just was not eating, and I got really big in touch. I would cry walking up the stairs to my therapist's office, and then I would just cry the whole 50 minutes. And he's like, okay, all right, well,
easy money.
Easy.
Oh my God.
Although Doug ugly cries, so that wasn't really fun. That wasn't probably all fun for him. And it was critical that he did that. It was critical that he just sat with me doing that stuff.
You needed that space.
Oh my God, I needed it. And it really was interesting. I remember the time I didn't cry, and I'm like,
now what am I supposed to do?
That?
And
it was really interesting to me, but he literally was very concerned. He goes, if you don't eat, you have to take meds.
Yeah.
We have to get you some medications. And so, but it was grief that really resembled depression, right?
Absolutely. And, if people go into a profound loss and they have a history of clinical depression or panic disorder or whatever, we will see that get exacerbated. And again, I don't know if it's so important to call it one or the other. I think, one of the things I always tell people, because grief also it really hurts in the body. Like the chest can hurt, like can feel like a heart attack. If you lose people to certain illnesses, your grief can mimic that.
Wow.
So if you lose someone to a brain tumor, you may get a lot of headaches in your grief. You may feel dizzy. You may feel lightheaded. If you colon cancer, you may have a lot of GI symptoms, a lot of cramping. That's a very common thing. I always want people to go to their medical provider, but I also always want people to tell their medical provider they just had a significant loss.
Yep.
It's really important that the medical providers know that.
Yep.
And my job right now is to make sure the medical providers do not poo-poo that.
Yeah. That's
And
amazing.
like, we'll just go home and take a bath and watch a funny movie. And that doesn't really work.
Right.
And so again, I think that's a great question. One of the things, meds have a purpose and they have a place.
Yep.
And there should be no shame about it. And if it's a one-time issue, and because I do see a lot of people go from that kind of grief space into a clinical depression, and that can be because of lack of sleep and lack of purpose and a lot of different things. And there is a grief diet. I can't tell you, people are half their size when they're really going through the trauma and the grief.
Yep.
So not a great clear answer that I'm giving you, because I don't know that there is one, but there's markers we look for. And one of them is weight. One of them is sleep. And certainly if somebody is presenting suicidal, I will take action on that too. But as a grief expert, so to speak, so my bio says, I
Chat GPT.
Yeah, I am a little more lenient on some of these things because I want people to be able to say those things out loud.
Right.
And
100%.
it makes sense to me why you wouldn't want to live in this circumstance. But after I assess it, but you're not going to kill yourself. That's a different thing. Not wanting to live and actively wanting to kill yourself are not necessarily the same thing.
I also will say, and we're kind of shifting gears from maybe what we can learn from the dying on their deathbed, but we're talking a little bit about, what people have in their process afterwards. And I will tell you that I worked with a family where a mother ran over her son.
Mm-hmm.
And the ability to grieve that and the ability to manage beyond that is excruciating. Yeah. There is no return from that. There's a lifelong grief process she will have for the rest of her life. Right. There's those are the dynamics. I have a friend who recently, his daughter suicided, and he immediately responded with, "I can't live anymore."
Mm-hmm.
But of course, then realized that how painful it was on the other side of that, and he would be doing that to all of us in his life.
Right.
So he had this awareness, and that is something that he learned from the dying.
Yes.
Right.
And yes, absolutely. And so another thing that I've learned from the dying is that the things we don't think we can do, we can often do. So I have sat with many people who have stage 4 disease. And I've said, what if I would have told you a year ago that you would have had metastatic pancreatic cancer and we're going to die in 2 months? And they'd say, oh my God, I would freak out. I would, whatever they say. And I said, but isn't that interesting that you're not? And that you're sitting here doing the thing you didn't think you could do. It's not pleasant. You don't love it, but you're doing it. And our unknown always becomes our known when we get to it. So the things that we're the most scared of and the uncertainty, we arrive to these things and we will instill people to help us. We will get people to help us. And so I think that's important to remember also in grief, is that we don't think we can do this, but we can. And I've learned that from the dying, these people in this bed thinking they're doing this with dignity and grace and even joy. And, you brought up something, Doug, about what if people can't communicate and have these conversations? There is the language of the dying that we know about. The dying speak in metaphors often. The travel metaphor, they're going to take the train. They got to get their shoes. They got to catch the bus. They got a boat to catch. Somebody's coming for them. There's going to be a party. I got to get dressed. I got to get up. I got to go. It's constant. But if they're not verbal, I will tell you there's a lot that I've learned from the dying. And that is when maybe they're staring at a bird and there's this expression of beauty. and they're so intrigued by this bird outside their bedroom window. How many birds have we seen today that we didn't look at?
Right.
We didn't really look at a bird. We didn't stop and look at the bird.
You know, what's so interesting about this. I was doing.
You have a fear of birds?
I don't.
Okay. That's good.
I don't. However, I was looking at the itinerary this morning in my yard on one of my hammock swings and chairs, and a hummingbird was totally like buzzing around me. And I'm like, I know that's supposed to mean something.
Yeah.
What is that?
Joy.
Oh,
It just felt amazing. Like it was just like going around.
But you noticed. You stopped and noticed. And that's what I've learned is to stop and notice. And I have seen people look at, I had a patient that there was an April, right before COVID, that we had a snowstorm. And she was dying. She ended up dying about 2 months after that. And she went out and made snow angels. Every single person that I encountered that day and that she encountered that day were griping about the snow in April.
Oh.
And she said, when it's your last snowfall, you want to embrace it. And she could barely walk. I mean, this family carried her out, made these snow angels. She thought it was the best thing. And I'm telling you, it stopped me. And I thought, okay.
Right.
And it's about she said, I can't change what's been given to me. But I can learn how to like live with this and do something different. I thought that's it right there.
And then if she can, then we must too. I mean, it just makes me so emotional. It's such a beautiful story.
It is. I mean, truly, like people are coming to see her and they're like, God, Crosstown was so slippery. And isn't it so cold and it's so gross? Like my tulips came up and she's thinking, yeah, but I'm going to live. She's also the same one. This is another beautiful lesson I talk about in my first book. And I titled the chapter This. And she was on a hike. There were 4 of them. And she had tumors in her hips and she was in a lot of pain. And they were up in this hike and they were all talking about, what are we going to get for the reward for doing the hike? Somebody said, I'm going to get a dirty martini. I'm going to grill a steak.
I'm in.
Yep. And then I'm going to make a chocolate tort. And they were all and they got to her and they said, Kim, what are you going to do? Or what's your reward for this hike? And she said, this hike is my reward for this hike.
Like what?
Like I can do this. And I thought, so often people that have read that will say this. They'll just say this because we're so into it's always better. Or when we get to it, it'll be better. And I don't know, that has really changed me profoundly.
I mean, that story makes me grossed out by the living. Like, don't be that guy. Like this is the lesson.
I know. Like just being here.
Yes. This is the reward.
Because there's a lot of people that aren't here and they don't have this right now. Even though it's a Sunday night and I know you guys have busy weeks tomorrow and these guys have jobs and everybody
football.
And football and all these things, and again, but we're human. It doesn't mean we can't, complain about things and all that, but it's asking of us to pause.
I love it. And it doesn't exactly segue into this question, but all of what you have said, everyone struggles to figure out how to support someone who is grieving. No one knows what to say. Everyone says the wrong thing. And then now we're talking about like, how do you even be brave enough to show up and try to support the dying? I wouldn't even, it's a completely different animal. And so it's our last question before we open it up to questions and answers. But do you have any thoughts about how to support the grieving and how to support the dying and how that might look different?
So you said something which was show up.
Yeah.
And then it's, there's a lot that the bereaved hear or people with terminal illness, which is call me if you need anything. Nobody's ever going to call.
Right. Worst thing to say is,
right. And I do believe people are well-intended. There's a phrase though, if you get nothing else out of this tonight, please don't ever start with at least. It is the most diminishing, innocent thing that people say, for instance, I worked with somebody who had a child loss. she does have two other children. At least you have two other children.
Oh,
people say
That is painful.
it's painful, or at least
look at the bright side.
at least you can do chemo, or at least whatever. And I think those are the really hard things. But how do you show up for the dying? We have to remember that dying people are living. Okay. And until they take their last breath, they're still living. So one of my beautiful patients said, everybody says, I could get hit by a bus tomorrow, whatever. And she goes, but I happen to be laying on the yellow line. That was her kind of her joke with it, that we throw these flippant things around. How do you show up for the dying? You consider them, they're living. And so you show up for them. And, and I will say to people in this moment, do you want to talk about the dying part, or do you want to talk about things around living? What do you want to talk about?
Good.
And so we ask people, because it's different for every person at the end of their life. Some people really don't want to deep dive and have these conversations. If they're working with me, they don't really get a choice. I mean, I will find a segue in there. But also, it's like, I want to share with you ways that you've mattered in my life. And that is the most beautiful thing, is to show up and say, Doug, one of the things I'm never going to forget this about you. And I want to give you specifics, and I want to say things. And that is a beautiful way. You don't have to sit and now talk about how does it feel that you're dying, and are you sad, and this is how you matter to me.
Oh, it's so beautiful.
I'm listening. Okay.
The list is too long.
That was a quick comeback.
Yeah, right. But isn't that like, don't we all want that?
Yes,
And then
it made me cry.
And like,
it's so
in
beautiful.
the HIV AIDS time, it reminded me a lot of COVID, where
sure.
COVID was so shameful. And COVID, you couldn't touch people. You couldn't have skin to skin. You couldn't. And I did, and I don't care now if the health system hears me say this, I took my gloves off with people living with HIV and dying with HIV and touch them. And I think that's a really important thing. If we can help people feel like they're not, because you're not going to, it's not
Untouchable.
contagious.
Yeah.
Dying
Absolutely.
is not contagious.
Right.
Neither is HIV, by the way. You have to do something to get it.
That's right.
Right.
So if someone sneezes, you're okay.
No, but
Correct.
but it's so important, because there is, I think, that as the living, we're terrified of dying. Well, it seems like you've done your work and you've reached a level of readiness that.
Well, I don't enjoy when the young people are dying. I don't even, but they're dying.
Yeah.
But
And
you've done your work around even just like
Yeah.
accepting that it is a natural part of life, even if we don't want it to be so.
Well, and the question that we just asked is really good, because there's no one who probably hasn't gone to somebody's deathbed
That's right.
or in a hospital, or you're going to see them for the last time.
Mm-hmm.
And it is difficult. Like, what the hell do you say? And how do you make sure you've said what you needed to say? So I love your answer.
I love it.
Right?
That it's basically like, do you want to talk about this
Right.
process?
And if they don't, but I still want to tell you how you matter.
Oh,
And
That's
that's a,
No matter what. No matter if
No
you
matter
want to
what.
talk about it or not, that's a lovely, lovely approach.
Yeah.
Kelly, I love you. This was amazing. I feel like my heart grew 12 times. And does any one of you lovely people here have a question for Kelly? And is there a mic?
Okay, so I have two questions. They're unrelated. So the first is, what do you tell people who are either not dying, but just living, and also people who are dying, who are afraid of dying or afraid of death? And then the other question I have, which is separate, is you mentioned narcissists and dealing with like people, like what's your experience of people who are dying that aren't like quite right mentally?
Yeah, I've never seen one. I'm kidding. So the first question, thank you for that. It's a beautiful question. Everybody is scared of dying, but not everybody is scared of being dead. Okay. So in my experience, dying is the process to getting there. Everybody is scared of suffering, unnatural suffering. How's my family going to deal with this? everybody that I've encountered. So first of all, I would never say, well, don't be scared of it. I would want to say that's natural to be scared of it. But I want to know, what are you scared of?
Right.
And many people, when they can say to me, I'm scared of suffocating, I'm scared of drowning, I'm scared of in my saliva, I'm scared of not knowing who my family are, whatever they may be. And I think it's important, but we all have, I, having seen death so early and seen it so traumatic, have developed a lot of fears. Anytime I have a chest discomfort, it triggers all these things like, will my mom or will my kids have to go through this? So as much as I'm comfortable working at the bedside of people, I have natural human experiences, fear of death. I also do a lot of work with funeral homes. So I've seen that whole industry. They can be very fearful of death as well, even though they're working with it all the time. So what do I say to people? I say it's natural. But I also say this is an opportunity for us to lean into. And if people are, well, I'm scared if I die, what if I didn't make a difference? What if I die before this? What if I die before that? But in all honesty, Leslie, the people that are the fear of dying is a very natural thing because it's the fear of suffering.
Yeah.
And so then we know that we have excellent medications. We live in a country that actually has a lot of access to incredible medications and things at the end.
Yep.
But a lot of people that have experienced trauma early on in life have a deep fear of dying. And I think it's a good opportunity to dive into that. I would never want to look at somebody and say, well, don't be scared of that.
Right.
I want to go, Leslie, to the second part of your question. When somebody's not healthy, or especially if they have a personality disorder that makes them really unlikely to be considerate of what other people might be going through. You mentioned narcissism.
Right.
It is unlikely to change at the deathbed, and you're likely to die as you lived, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that the downside of this is that, the goal of therapy, in my opinion, is to live an honest life, whatever that is. I don't give a shit what people want to do as long as it doesn't hurt other people.
Mind your own damn business.
Mind your own damn business. I think there's a t-shirt going on politically about that. But I would say that, that's the complicated matter. Like people trying to resolve stuff with someone who has no ability to do that. That's where it gets complicated. And so I think that's where it's rough.
Yeah.
Because that person is unlikely to say, I'm sorry I did that, or I'm sorry that when I did that, or I'm sorry I wasn't a great parent.
Right.
It's really hard to get a narcissist to do that. So I would encourage people to know you're not necessarily going to get resolution when you walk into the bed.
Right. And so, And yet I've also seen people become very humble in death. Like their typical MO it isn't really working anymore. So you can be a real jerk, but you need this staff.
Yeah.
And so you need to be but I agree with you, Doug. And I think what we have to remember is if we love somebody who has a personality disorder and they're dying, the expectation should be focused on us, not them. So that we say what we need to say. Now, I've had people say at the deathbed, it's not, none of us would want it, but they have said, you hurt me so much in my life. I will never be able to love another person or be intimate with another person because of what you've done, or trust another person. Wow. I don't ever interject. It's the honest experience. It's the whatever. I do work then with the forgiveness work if we can. And it's hard. And then you've got this vulnerable person who doesn't have a lot of strength. And what do? Well, they have to lay there and, and take that. And so it's not all daisies and unicorns in all these bedside scenarios.
But it's real. That is
real.
Real. Wow.
It's real. It's real.
When I think about what I always picture is that the dying are protected as don't say anything that's going to upset them, or make sure that shh, don't say anything in front of them. But that's revolutionary. That if there's no remorse and there's no attempt to reconcile, that it's our chance to speak our truth.
Right.
Ooh, wow.
Right. And so, when that has happened, I then will sit with the patient after that leaves and try to, do something, because it can affect their dying. I mean, it can make for a very uncomfortable death. And I don't care what people have done. I don't want people to be tormented on their deathbed. It's not part of my belief system. And so, but it was important for them to say it. There's a lot of things that can be said because some people have abusers that they can't face. I've written lots of letters with people that will write it to their person. And, there's a lot of power in putting it at a gravesite or.
Oh my God, there's a ton of stuff you can do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Rituals, right?
Rituals to grieve and bereave. Which is the clinical term in the diagnostic manual. The other lesson that we have out of all of this is take care of business while the person is alive, if you can, right? So, with a narcissist, even let them know how their behavior impacts you. You are unlikely. My mother, I was on your conversations with Kelly talking about estrangement grief with my mother, but I had let her know that she was not a great mother for me, right? There was not a maternal piece to our relationship. And it was good to give her that. She was not going to respond. Right. So
she died like she lived.
She did.
She did.
Yeah.
But you maybe had
I feel total resolve. Yeah.
Resolution.
And again, it's not that we can't change. So I don't want people to walk out and say, oh, I've made mistakes. That means I'm going to die that person. But you have to do your work.
Right.
Today is the day, everybody.
Yeah. It's
starting
the day.
now.
So we're locking the door.
That's right.
This has now become a sleepover retreat.
That's right.
Does anyone else have any questions for Kelly?
I just want to set up a scenario and see where this goes. My husband, Tom, died nearly 2 years ago, 17th of November. And he died of COVID-related pneumonia, essentially. But it was almost a 2-month process of this. He got sick early September and seemed to get better, but we thought no, because he was having a hard time breathing and all that. And by the end of October, he was in respiratory failure. We had to bring him into the hospital, and he was on just a mask for about a night, but then he was on a respirator from about the 1st of November through the 17th. Now, I guess the scenario is he didn't open his eyes. He didn't speak. Well, he couldn't because he had the respirator on. One day in that process, one of the medical people came over and said, it's very curious because when you walk in the room, his blood pressure increases.
Wow.
Now, there are a couple ways I could take that. One is that he was pissed off at me and the blood pressure increases. I don't choose that that's the deal. I think it probably has to do with he recognized that I was there. But that, I don't, I think I've reconciled that to a certain extent, but I'm not sure where to go with that after a period of time. I think I'm doing fairly well. I function well. I haven't done some of those things where I said, I want to kill myself or I can't live anymore and I can't go on. But that's an interesting thing. I know I'm not alone in that because there are people that are on respirators for periods of time. And I and my daughter had to make the decision when to stop that.
First of all, thank you for sharing that. And, COVID is an interesting thing. I saw a lot of people who lost loved ones in COVID. And then, there's all this conspiracy theory and stuff. And so I just want to acknowledge your grief that to stay away from. At the time when I did grief groups for COVID, I would tell people to stay away from social media. Because the world is trying to diminish, oh, this isn't real and blah, 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 blah. I would say 99.9 and a half that his blood pressure would respond because in a positive way.
Me too.
And what you have to do is look at, so people are more than the way they died. Okay. There's a total life prior to death. So we focus so much on that. This person had they suicided. But what's important is we remember they lived prior to the suicide. And we have to really, that's where I want to move people away from the cause and manner of death. And so you look at your life with Tom overall. And that's where you look at, well, of course the blood pressure is going up, because where does love get carried? Here in the heart. And it pumps profoundly. And I think that is a beautiful way. I would love you to land there. I really would. And then to remember that it was about your life with Tom, not just Tom's death and the way he died. And it can be very hard. A lot of the people I work with, that's their lead-in, is how the person died and what happened with death. And you'd see that. And then they loved when I'd have them share the life that they experienced with them, because they're holding themselves accountable for, why didn't I pick up the phone prior to the car accident? Why didn't I notice the wheezing? Why didn't I notice that they were more tired? Why didn't I? And so we go back to the life, and the life with Tom is the reason the heart was pumping so strongly.
And I would say too, Steve, thank you for sharing your story, and I'm sorry for your loss. It's clear that you're still processing that. And as we know from every conversation about grief we have, there is no finite way that shows up. And I appreciate that you're still in it. And I think we look for certainty, and we look for resolve, and we look for there to be an end to that process. Kubler-Ross does talk about, acceptance as the final stage. I think that's not exactly how it works. And I encourage you to kind of just stick with what's honest for you. And even as you were talking, it was just very genuine and honest and sincere. And your process is what it is. So keep talking. I think that's the biggest recommendation I have for you in terms of processing this. I got to be honest, there's no way it was anything but he recognized you. He wished he could reach out to you. He wished he could talk to you. You had a significant relationship. And again, what Kelly is talking about, learning from the dying, people oftentimes get really, really calm and clear. So all the shit that might have happened in your relationship, because no relationship is perfect.
Right.
It just doesn't work. And so we all make mistakes, right? So I would say to you, Steve, recognize that he probably had total resolve at the end of this process. I'm glad you don't. I also want to add one more piece about COVID. Any of us in mental health are aware that this is a very lasting aftermath of what is a worldwide pandemic that killed so many people. And that, for people who did not believe it was real, for people who did not believe in any sort of protection through vaccination, et cetera, it complicates our ability. It's kind of like HIV. Like that's Ronald Reagan was, I'm going to try not to swear when I talk about him. He said it was a gay disease. It was a sinful disease, and he wasn't going to provide any sort of support for research. It complicates our grief process when it's disenfranchised, a word that Kelly and I use quite a bit. So I think this worldwide experience of like trying to recover from COVID is craziness, which we're not through it yet. We still have people who get it. We still have people who die of it. So it's an interesting sort of shared experience that you have as well.
I mean, what a powerful experience to share a stage and have this conversation with you. I'm
honored.
so grateful. Will you tell us? I might be stealing your line. I don't even know. I can't even read. I've written so many notes everywhere.
Let me circle something.
Will you tell people where they can find you?
I'm in this chair up here. No,
Will you orient yourself to time and place?
So I am on Instagram. Would love you to follow me on Instagram. It's called See My Grief. And I just had to redo my Instagram because I got hacked. No. So, we live in a world where followers are everything. And I lost a lot of my followers. And they're probably wondering why I never post. Well, I am now on See My Grief. And then on Facebook, Conversations with Kelly.
Which was your podcast?
Which is my podcast is See My Grief.
Oh,
yeah.
Not Conversations with Kelly. Was it both?
I think it changed or something. I'm not sure.
I think you should know.
I know.
Yes.
I'm so not into the details of things. And then I am doing a book signing up here for my second book. I do have a couple of my first. This book is When Love Meets Grief. It's titled When Love Meets Grief, and it's reflections from the bedside. One of the things I would encourage people to do is read the last chapter first. If you're intrigued, it's about signs of people when they come back and visit, and things that have been shared with me over the years that, again, make it hard to say there's nothing. And again, I don't ever want people to feel like I'm talking you into anything. If you don't believe, that's okay. But I've seen my favorite was the atheist at the end that said, Jesus, with tears. And it was like, Jesus? What? And then died, literally. And it was one of the most, not like.
It's the best story.
I know.
I'm glad you.
It was a.
I have more questions.
Yeah, it is just like, and it's been so great for that family because they're just like, but he's like, kind of like,
he found Jesus.
Kind of like,
That's great.
And I did have their dog came back and nobody would ever known who was Toffee. I think the dog's name was Toffee. If you're listening, maybe it was Taffy. I'm sorry, but one of the candies. And they kept talking about Toffee. And I finally said to the family, who is Toffee? Do they love Toffee? And they're like, that was our dog that died 10 years ago. And it was Toffee and reaching up Toffee. And I'm just like, so even the animals.
By the way, one of my psychic clients gave me a message from my dead dog.
Yes.
And it was right on. Thank you for the blue pillow.
That brings me so much joy and comfort to think about.
So pets are watching us.
Yeah, right.
Be aware.
So I want to thank you to keep doing this good work. I want to thank you guys really for coming and for producing and sharing. And I think the thing I would say the most as you go away is ask yourself what matters most, who matters most to you. And that's where your energy goes. Yeah. Like that's where your energy goes. And we get caught in the weeds. We all do it. A lot of noise, so much noise right now.
I love you both, and you both made a difference in my life.
Oh,
thank you.
And
I love you.
There's somebody dressed in black that's got a really big birthday tomorrow.
Exactly.
We're not talking about that.
And we can all write notes about how much you've mattered to us. And we should do not our intro, but our outro. So as you know, we're not fine. And if you got any value out of today, you could find us on Instagram and TikTok. It's all We're Not Fine. We're Not Fine Pod. Douglas L. Jensen with an EN. Dr. Talia Jackson. And subscribe, tell your friends. Lovers, your enemies.
We have a website, and of course you can subscribe there and you'll get up-to-date information on all of these events. The lovely person in the front asked if we do this monthly. Yes, we do. Please subscribe. You now have our logo all over you. So you'll be a walking marketing strategy. We appreciate that. Yes. We'd love to have you subscribe. It's free. And you can obviously know what's going on for us.
I may have already subscribed you because that's why I asked for the email of who was signing up. So basically, if you've joined an event, congratulations, you're getting our monthly newsletter.
Cute.
Thank you all very much for coming.
Yes, and if you want to take a look at the merch with Jimmy Goat, with Doug's best friend growing up.
My only friend.
We're his best friends now, but that Jimmy Goat was it.
Right.
So we've got merch. And have some Prosecco. Look around at the beautiful art. Mingle.
Oh, thank you guys.
Thanks all.
And thank you again.